Poor girl stands up for elderly man, not knowing he's a billionaire's dad. Melissa was just a quiet, kind-hearted girl trying to survive in the chaos of New York City. She had landed a job at Valentina Vogue, one of the city's most prestigious fashion boutiques. But every day felt like walking on broken glass. Her coworkers constantly mocked her thrift store clothes, whispered behind her back, and treated her like an outsider. The manager, Claire, made things worse, assigning her to mop floors, fetch overpriced coffee, and handle inventory in the dusty back room, instead of letting her interact with customers like the others. Whenever Melissa did manage to assist a client, Claire would take the credit and the commission, leaving her with nothing but empty praise and exhaustion. But Melissa never complained. She needed the money. Rent in the Bronx wasn't cheap, and every dollar she earned went straight into survival. While her coworkers wore designer heels and designer attitudes, Melissa showed up in worn flats with a hopeful smile. She believed that if she worked hard enough, maybe someone would notice her worth. Maybe one day things would change. But day after day, all she received was scorn. "You really don't belong here," Claire would sneer, eyes full of disdain. And still, Melissa stayed, because despite the cruelty, despite the humiliation, she had something they didn't: empathy. She treated everyone with kindness, no matter how they looked. She believed that being good would somehow lead to something better. She had no idea that one ordinary afternoon, when the glass doors chimed and a shabby old man stepped in, everything in her life would begin to shift. It was a cold Thursday afternoon when Melissa found herself alone on the boutique floor, folding silk scarves that she could never afford to wear. Her feet ached, her hands were dry from hours of cleaning, and her mind was already drifting to the long subway ride home. That's when the boutique's glass doors opened with a soft chime, and in walked a man who looked completely out of place. He was elderly, probably in his 70s, wearing a threadbare coat with fraying sleeves, mismatched shoes, and a cap that had clearly seen better days. His hair was messy, his face worn by time, and his smile, gentle but tired, was met instantly with contempt. One of Melissa's coworkers, Tricia, wrinkled her nose and hissed, "Sir, you can't be in here. This isn't a shelter." The old man gave a soft chuckle, trying to keep his dignity. "I just wanted to look," he said quietly. But before he could say anything more, Claire, Melissa's manager, came striding over in her designer heels, perfume clouding the air. She looked him up and down like he was dirt on her shoes. "We don't serve people like you," she snapped. "This is a luxury boutique, not a Goodwill. Leave before you make the place smell like poverty." The other staff laughed cruelly, making no effort to hide their amusement. Melissa felt her stomach twist. She knew that kind of humiliation far too well. Without thinking, she stepped forward, gently touching the old man's arm. "Sir," she said softly, "would you like to sit down? Maybe have a glass of water?" His eyes widened in surprise. No one had spoken to him with kindness in a very long time. "That would be nice," he whispered. She helped him to a chair and brought him a cold glass of water, ignoring the mocking stares of her coworkers. "Take your time," she said with a warm smile. "If you need help with anything, I'll be right here." The old man's hands trembled slightly as he took the glass, and then he looked at Melissa with eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. "Good things happen to good people," he whispered, almost like a prayer. Melissa wasn't sure why those words struck her so hard, but they did. And when he asked her to help him choose 10 full outfits, suits, shirts, shoes, ties, she didn't hesitate. Her coworkers burst into giggles behind her, calling her foolish. Claire leaned against the counter with a smirk, whispering, "Watch this blow up in her face." But Melissa didn't care. She carefully chose each item based on his frame and tone, treating him like the most important client in the store. When she told him the total was over $200, he patted his pockets, then chuckled. "Oh dear," he said, "I don't have any money on me." The room erupted in laughter. Tricia doubled over. Claire clapped her hands mockingly. "Are you serious?" she spat. "You wasted your time on a homeless joke?" Melissa's heart sank. She turned to the old man and asked gently, "You don't have any money at all?" He smiled sadly. "I do," he said, "but it's with my grandson. He's very rich. I just need to find him." Claire cackled. "Oh, sure," she mocked. Let me guess. His name is Santa Claus? The cruelty was unbearable, but Melissa didn't waver. She took a deep breath, reached into her bag, and pulled out her last $20 bill. She pressed it into his hand and whispered, "At least let me get you a taxi." His hands shook as he looked at her. "You're a rare soul," he murmured. Claire was furious. "You're fired," she snarled. "You've embarrassed this boutique for the last time. Get out." Melissa didn't argue. She picked up her bag, gave one last smile to the old man, and walked out. She didn't know where she'd go. She didn't know how she'd pay rent. But she knew one thing for certain. She had done the right thing. What she didn't know was that the man she helped so humbly, so selflessly, was not just a poor old stranger. He was Henry Lancaster, the father of Ethan Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster and Company, the billion-dollar fashion empire that owned the very boutique she had just been fired from. And that small act of kindness? It had just changed the course of her entire life. Melissa had no idea that the $20 bill she gave away in an act of quiet compassion would be the very thing to unravel her entire world and rebuild it into something unimaginable. That evening, as she sat alone in her small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of Harlem, a knock at the door made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her heart raced as she tiptoed toward the door and opened it just a crack. Standing outside was a tall man in a tailored black suit, polished shoes, and a calm, professional demeanor. "Miss Melissa Hart?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "My name is Gabriel. I'm the personal assistant to Mr. Ethan Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster & Co. My employer would like to speak with you." Immediately, Melissa blinked, her brain lagging behind her reality. "The Ethan Lancaster?" she asked. "The fashion tycoon?" Gabriel offered a courteous nod. "Yes, Mr. Lancaster and his father would be honored if you joined them at their estate." Melissa's first instinct was suspicion. It had to be a mistake. Or worse, some scam. But something in Gabriel's voice, calm and respectful, told her this wasn't a trick. Still hesitant, she asked, "Why me?" Gabriel's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Because of what you did today." An hour later, after showering and putting on her neatest outfit, Melissa found herself sitting in the back of a sleek, black Rolls-Royce. The city passed by in a blur of lights and confusion as she clutched her purse like a lifeline, her heart pounding in her chest. When the car turned onto a private road flanked by tall hedges and entered through iron gates, she realized this wasn't just a house. It was a mansion. No, a palace. Marble pillars, glowing chandeliers through massive windows, fountains lit from below like art installations. She had never seen anything like it. Staff in uniforms stood in perfect lines as Gabriel opened the door and offered her his hand. "Right this way, Miss Hart." Melissa stepped onto the stone driveway, shoes clicking awkwardly against the perfection beneath her feet. She was led through golden doors, past halls adorned with famous paintings and vases older than the city itself, until they stopped at a grand staircase. And standing at the top of it, bathed in warm light like a scene from a film, was a man she had only seen in magazines. Ethan Lancaster, the youngest CEO in fashion history. Forbes cover boy, billionaire at 32, known for his charm, brilliance, and an expression that rarely gave anything away. Except now, because as he looked down at Melissa, his eyes, steel gray and impossibly sharp, softened. Slowly, he descended the stairs with elegance and confidence, never breaking eye contact. "Miss Hart," he said when he reached her, "I believe you've met my father." Melissa's throat tightened. "I didn't know who he was. Ethan raised a hand, stopping her. "You don't need to explain. He told me everything. What you did, your kindness, your courage. It meant the world to him. And to me." Behind Ethan, the old man stepped into view. Except he looked completely different now. Gone were the ragged clothes and messy hair. Now, Mr. Henry Lancaster stood tall in a tailored three-piece suit, his silver hair combed back neatly, and his smile radiant with life. "Melissa," he said warmly, "you reminded me that there's still good in this world." Ethan turned toward his father, then back to Melissa. "We'd like to invite you to stay with us for a few days," he said. "You've done something no one else has done in a long time. Treated my father like a human being." "Not a problem. This home. Our family owes you at least that much." Melissa opened her mouth to object, to say she couldn't possibly accept such an offer. But the sincerity in their eyes silenced her. She nodded slowly, still stunned, and followed them deeper into the estate. The next morning, Melissa awoke in a room bigger than her entire apartment. The sheets were softer than clouds. The view stretched across endless green lawns. And breakfast had been brought to her door. She felt like she was trapped in someone else's dream. Later that day, she wandered into the garden and found Henry reading under a tree. They spoke for hours. He told her about his late wife, about the early days of Lancaster and Company, about how success had made many people forget what kindness looked like. But you, he said, smiling, you remembered. That afternoon, Ethan joined them. He was quieter, more reserved, but his presence filled every space. Over the next few days, he and Melissa crossed paths more frequently, accidentally at first. Then intentionally, he invited her to tour the design studio, asked her opinion on a fabric line, even sat with her during lunch in the sunroom. Melissa began to see a different side of him. Not the billionaire mogul, but the man beneath it, thoughtful, sharp-witted, protective of his family, yet tired of being surrounded by people who only saw his money. He saw something in Melissa he didn't see in others, realness. And Melissa, despite her nerves, found herself drawn to him too. He wasn't just handsome and successful, he listened. He noticed things. He remembered her favorite tea after just one mention. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and painted the sky in gold, Ethan stood beside her on the balcony. You know, he said softly, when my father first told me about you, I didn't expect much, just another nice story. But you're not just kind. You're fearless. Melissa looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. Her heart was pounding again. But not from nerves. This time, it was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan turned to face her fully. You're not just a girl who helped my father, he said. You're the kind of person I want around me. The kind who makes this world feel less hollow. And in that moment, something changed. Neither of them said it aloud, but it was there. In the way they looked at each other. In the silence between their words. In the warmth of a shared breath. Melissa had arrived at the Lancaster mansion as a nobody. But in just a few days, she had become something more. Not because of money, not because of status, but because of who she was. Ethan Lancaster, the man who had everything, had finally met someone who reminded him what truly mattered. And for Melissa, a girl who had been treated like she didn't belong. This place, this unlikely castle of marble and gold, suddenly felt like home. Melissa had barely adjusted to life inside the Lancaster estate when the storm began to brew. Everything had felt like a dream. Meals prepared by chefs. Silk sheets on a bed softer than anything she'd ever known. Warm conversations with Mr. Lancaster, and the quiet, simmering connection forming between her and Ethan. But that dream quickly began to unravel the day Lucy Hawthorne walked through the gates. Lucy was everything Melissa wasn't: glamorous, polished, and utterly ruthless. A legacy socialite with old money. Lucy had long convinced herself that Ethan was her destined future. Though he had never officially dated her, she clung to the illusion, proudly parading herself in social columns as Ethan's one true match. So when she saw Melissa, simple, modest Melissa, not only staying in the Lancaster mansion but laughing in the garden with Ethan and chatting easily with Mr. Lancaster, her rage boiled beneath her perfect makeup and designer heels. Lucy wasted no time. She marched into the mansion like she owned the place. Her tone sweet but her words dripping with venom. "Oh, who's this?" she asked with an artificial smile when she met Melissa in the grand hall. "A new maid? Or did the foundation start taking in charity cases?" Melissa tried to remain calm, offered a polite smile, and quietly walked away. But Lucy didn't stop there. Over the next few days, she used every ounce of her influence to poison the household against Melissa. She whispered to the housekeepers that Melissa was using Ethan. She hinted to family friends that Melissa's sudden presence felt suspiciously calculated. And worst of all, she made sure Lady Beatrice Lancaster, Ethan's notoriously difficult and traditional mother, heard every rumor. Melissa could feel the shift. Staff who once greeted her with smiles now looked the other way. Whispers followed her down the hallways. Even her usual morning tea went missing more often than not. Still, she held her head high. She knew this was Lucy's doing, and she refused to let a woman like her shake her kindness or her dignity. But Lucy wasn't satisfied with gossip. She wanted Melissa gone, humiliated, erased from Ethan's life. So she plotted something bigger, something irreversible. One quiet morning, while most of the household was at a charity gala, Lucy slipped into the east wing where Melissa's room was located, with the help of a private key she had stolen from a distracted maid. She entered the Lancaster family's private jewelry gallery. Inside, under glass cases and velvet cloths, lay some of the most priceless heirlooms in the country, necklaces that had once belonged to royalty. Brooches passed down for generations. Lucy carefully selected a sapphire and diamond necklace worth over $7 million. One that had been publicly featured in magazines. Everyone in the family would recognize it instantly. She took it and quietly tucked it into Melissa's wardrobe, hidden beneath a stack of neatly folded sweaters. Then she waited. The next morning, just as Melissa was preparing to go down for breakfast, the double doors of the mansion burst open. Guards stormed into her room without warning. "Miss Hart," one of them said sternly, "we need you to come with us." "What? Why?" Melissa asked, heart racing. "You are being questioned for the theft of a Lancaster family heirloom." Melissa's breath caught. "That's a mistake, I didn't take anything." But before she could say more, Lucy appeared behind them, tears in her eyes, voice shaking with false innocence. "I didn't want to believe it," she whispered, "but the maids found the necklace in her room. I thought she was my friend." Melissa stared at her, frozen. "You planted it," she whispered, but no one listened. Lady Beatrice arrived minutes later, her face pale with fury. "I knew it," she said coldly. "You charmed your way into this house, into my son's life, and now you steal from us?" Melissa's heart shattered. "I didn't," she tried to say. "I would never." Mr. Lancaster stepped forward, his voice calm but stern. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We will investigate this properly." But the damage was already done. Melissa looked around at the faces she had come to trust, and all she saw now was doubt. Ethan had not yet arrived. He was at a business meeting in London. But she couldn't bear to stay a moment longer. That afternoon, she packed her things with trembling hands and left the estate, her chest hollow, her name tarnished. Lucy watched from the balcony, sipping tea, her smile victorious. But what she didn't know was that Ethan had already started digging. The moment he heard the accusation, something didn't sit right with him. Melissa had never once asked for anything, never taken a gift, never acted entitled. She had shown integrity and kindness even in the smallest moments. So Ethan personally reviewed every camera feed from the past 48 hours. And what he found left no doubt. Footage showed Lucy entering the jewelry gallery alone, then slipping into Melissa's room. There it was, clear, undeniable, time-stamped truth. The next morning, Ethan returned to the estate with fire in his eyes. He didn't stop to greet anyone. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He stormed into the grand hall, where Lucy was enjoying breakfast with Lady Beatrice. "Lucy," he said coldly, causing her to look up in feigned surprise. "Ethan, you're back." Be quiet," he snapped. The room went silent. Servants froze mid-step. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Ethan held up a tablet, pressed play, and turned the screen toward them. The footage spoke for itself. Lucy's face turned white. "I can explain." "You won't need to," Ethan said flatly. "You're no longer welcome here. And as of today, you are permanently banned from all Lancaster properties." Lady Beatrice stood, shocked. "Is this true?" she whispered. Ethan turned to her, pain in his voice. "She framed someone who had done nothing but show kindness to our family. If Melissa doesn't belong here, then none of us do." Lucy tried to protest, but guards were already escorting her out. Her heels clicked furiously on the marble floors as she screamed Ethan's name one last time. But he never looked back. And at that exact moment, miles away in a tiny apartment, Melissa sat on the edge of her bed, trying not to cry. Her phone buzzed. One message: "Come home." It was from Ethan. Melissa sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea. The silence so loud it felt like it was pressing against her chest. It had only been 3 days since she was escorted out of the Lancaster estate. Her name sullied, her integrity questioned, and her heart quietly breaking. She kept replaying it all. Lucy's fake tears. The guards tearing through her things. Lady Beatrice's cold words. And worst of all, the look of disappointment in the eyes of the people she had once trusted. Melissa hadn't stolen anything, but the truth didn't seem to matter anymore. In the eyes of high society, perception was everything, and hers had been destroyed. That morning, the knock on her door startled her. When she opened it, she didn't expect to see her standing there. Lady Beatrice Lancaster, regal as ever, wearing an ivory suit so crisp it looked sculpted, stood in the hallway of Melissa's rundown building like a queen visiting a peasant's hut. Behind her, a driver waited beside a sleek car, its engine still humming softly. "May I come in?" Lady Beatrice asked coolly. Melissa hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, her stomach tight with nerves. The woman stepped inside, glancing around at the modest furniture and peeling paint with an expression caught somewhere between discomfort and curiosity. "This is where you live?" she asked, her tone not unkind, but distant. Melissa nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Lady Beatrice walked to the center of the room and turned to face her. "I'll be direct," she said. "My family has been through enough scandal. I don't want any more stories in the press. No more speculation. You're not one of us. And you never will be. But you already knew that." Melissa stood quietly, waiting. "I've come with an offer," Lady Beatrice continued, reaching into her designer handbag. She pulled out a checkbook, opened it with practiced grace, and scribbled something down. Then she tore it from the pad and placed it on Melissa's small coffee table. $5 million, she said calmly. "Tax-free. No strings. All you have to do is disappear. Leave Ethan alone. Walk away and never come back." Melissa stared at the check, her breath catching in her throat. $5 million. She had never seen more than a few thousand in her bank account at any time. And now, more money than she could ever dream of was sitting right in front of her. With that kind of money, she could change her entire life, pay off debt, buy a home, help her community, finally live without fear of eviction. But as she looked at Lady Beatrice, then back down at the check, something stirred deep inside her. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, not from temptation, but from anger. Not a word was spoken as she carefully tore the check straight down the middle. Then she tore it again, until the pieces fluttered onto the table like snow. "I didn't fall in love with Ethan for his name, or his bank account," Melissa said softly, her voice firm but controlled. "I never asked him for anything. I helped his father because it was the right thing to do. Not because I wanted to be rewarded. I didn't come into your lives to take. And I will not be bought to walk away." Lady Beatrice's expression didn't change at first. She simply looked at the shredded paper, then back at Melissa, as if trying to gauge whether the girl before her was foolish or fearless. Finally, the older woman let out a soft sigh. "You're stronger than I thought," she admitted. "You have conviction." She paused, then added quietly, "Most people would have taken the money." Melissa gave a small, sad smile. "I'm not most people." Lady Beatrice didn't argue. Instead, she turned toward the door, heels clicking on the worn hardwood floor. Just before stepping out, she looked back at Melissa one last time. "Perhaps I was wrong about you," she said. Then she was gone. Melissa stood in the center of her apartment, her heart racing, her eyes burning, but her soul light. She had walked away from $5 million. But for the first time in her life, she felt priceless. She hadn't let them define her. She hadn't sold her worth. And somewhere, she hoped, no, she believed, that Ethan would understand. Ethan Lancaster hadn't spoken much the day Melissa left. He stood in the entryway of the estate, watching her disappear through the gates, his jaw clenched and eyes dark with something deeper than anger, betrayal. Not toward her, but toward himself for letting her walk away in pain. But even as the rest of the household whispered, even as Lucy pretended to be the savior who had exposed the thief, Ethan said nothing. He didn't have to, because while the world assumed he'd moved on, Ethan was already working behind the scenes, digging through hours of surveillance footage, questioning staff, reviewing every detail of the timeline. He didn't believe for a second that Melissa was guilty. Not the girl who gave his father her last $20. Not the woman who had never once asked for anything in return. When he finally saw it, Lucy sneaking into the jewelry room, Slipping something into Melissa's wardrobe, his blood went cold. The betrayal was worse than he imagined. And this time, he didn't stay silent. The next morning, the Lancaster estate was unusually quiet. Staff tiptoed through the halls, sensing something was coming, and it came swiftly. Ethan strode into the grand salon where Lucy was seated, casually flipping through a fashion magazine, acting as if she hadn't just destroyed someone's life. Lady Beatrice sat nearby, sipping tea with perfectly restrained poise, still uncertain about where she stood. But all eyes turned when Ethan entered. His steps were sharp, his face unreadable. Without a word, he reached for the remote and turned on the large screen mounted on the wall. The room went silent. The footage rolled. Lucy, the jewelry gallery, the necklace, her slipping into Melissa's room. The exact moment she planted the evidence. Gasps filled the air. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened in disbelief. Lucy, Ethan said, his voice like ice. You framed her. You humiliated someone who did nothing to you. Lucy jumped up, pale as the cream-colored walls. No, this has to be fake. Someone edited that footage. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. You're done here. He turned to security. Escort her off the property. She's banned. Permanently. Lucy's voice cracked as she protested, begging, screaming Ethan's name. But no one listened. The guards led her out as she cursed Melissa's name, her mascara streaking like ink across her cheeks. But Ethan didn't flinch. He was already reaching for his phone. The next stop was Melissa. He found her exactly where he knew she'd be, sitting in the tiny corner cafe she used to visit after work, tucked into a booth near the window, nursing a single cup of coffee she could barely afford. When she saw him walk in, her heart nearly stopped. She stood quickly, unsure whether to run or speak. But Ethan crossed the space in seconds and took her hand before she could say a word. I was wrong, he said, his voice low, full of guilt and something else, hope. You never should have had to walk out that door. I should have fought for you then. I'm here now. Melissa's lips parted, the emotions rushing back all at once, pain, disbelief, love. But before she could respond, Ethan dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the cafe. The world slowed, conversations halted, chairs stopped creaking, everyone turned to look. Ethan pulled out a ring, not just any ring, but a vintage piece that once belonged to his grandmother. Simple, beautiful, timeless. Melissa Hart, he said, voice shaking only slightly. You taught me what it means to love without conditions. You stood by my father when no one else would. You stood by me even when I didn't deserve it. I don't want a perfect life. I want a real one. With you. Will you marry me? Melissa's hands flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. And for a moment she just nodded, unable to speak. Then, finally, she whispered the only word that mattered. Yes. The cafe erupted in applause. But in Ethan's world, only her voice existed. And as he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, he knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. The morning of the wedding felt like a scene pulled straight from a dream. Soft golden light spilled through the tall cathedral windows as rows of ivory flowers lined the marble aisle, and the sound of a string quartet echoed like whispers of a fairy tale. Melissa stood behind the grand wooden doors, her hands gently gripping the bouquet of white peonies, her heart racing beneath the layers of her custom couture gown. The dress shimmered like morning dew, delicately embroidered with crystals and pearls, hugging her like it was made by destiny itself. Just weeks ago, she had been folding shirts in the back of a boutique, ridiculed and invisible. Now, she was minutes away from becoming Melissa Lancaster, wife of one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. Outside, a sea of cameras flashed as royalty, celebrities, and business moguls poured into the venue. Headlines were already being written: the Cinderella bride, from nobody to Lancaster heiress, the girl who won the billionaire's heart. But Melissa didn't care about any of that. Her eyes were locked on the mahogany doors in front of her. And beyond them, she knew Ethan was waiting. When the music swelled and the doors creaked open, everyone rose to their feet. Gasps filled the cathedral, but Melissa didn't notice. All she saw was Ethan, standing at the altar in a tailored black tuxedo, his eyes never leaving hers. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, like he couldn't breathe without her. And as she walked toward him, every cruel word she'd ever endured, every hardship, Every moment of self-doubt melted away. This was her moment, their moment. The ceremony was elegant, heartfelt, and sacred. When Ethan took her hands in his, he leaned in and whispered, "You made me believe in something real." And Melissa's eyes welled with tears. They exchanged vows that silenced the crowd. And when he kissed her, it wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise. A vow sealed not just by rings, but by everything they had overcome together. The reception was held in the Lancaster Estate's grand ballroom, transformed into a wonderland of crystal chandeliers, candlelit tables, and soft jazz music. Mr. Lancaster stood and raised a toast, his voice filled with pride as he welcomed Melissa into the family. Even Lady Beatrice, once her fiercest critic, took her hand and whispered, "I was wrong about you. I see that now." And Melissa smiled, not with arrogance, but with quiet gratitude. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was stepping into a new chapter. One she had earned not by wealth or beauty, but by kindness, courage, and unwavering character. As the night wore on and the stars lit up the sky outside, Ethan pulled Melissa into the center of the floor for their first dance. The crowd faded, the music softened, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, spinning slowly in a world they built on love. Melissa had once been invisible, overlooked, tossed aside, but now, in the arms of the man who had chosen her not for status but for soul, she had become something more. Not just a bride, not just a Lancaster, but the woman who proved that true love doesn't care where you come from, only who you are. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the Lancaster estate as lanterns flickered to life across the gardens and chandeliers sparkled inside the grand ballroom. It was a wedding the world would talk about for years, elegant, regal, timeless. But for Melissa, it wasn't about the media coverage or the A-list guests in attendance. It wasn't about the $1 million dress or the floral arrangements flown in from France. It was about standing across from Ethan, the man who had seen her heart when no one else bothered to look past her worn shoes and quiet voice. She had walked a long, painful road to get here, from being humiliated in a boutique, falsely accused of theft, offered money to disappear, to finally being embraced by a family that once rejected her. And now, standing in front of friends, family, and the entire world, she was marrying not just the CEO of Lancaster and Company, but the man who had chosen her, defended her, and loved her without condition. The ceremony was beautiful, every word soaked in sincerity. Ethan's vows were not rehearsed, they came straight from the heart. "You reminded me what matters," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You made me believe that love isn't about status, but about soul, and I promise to honor your heart for the rest of my life." When Melissa spoke, her voice was steady. "You gave me a place in a world that once told me I didn't belong. But more than that, you loved me when I had nothing to offer but honesty." And when they kissed, the applause that erupted wasn't just polite celebration, it was recognition of something rare, something real. As they walked hand in hand into the reception, the guests rising to greet them, Melissa caught a glimpse of Mr. Lancaster standing to the side, smiling with glassy eyes. Lady Beatrice, who had once offered millions to keep Melissa away, now stood beside her with quiet pride. Even the doubters could no longer deny the truth. Melissa had earned this, not with money, not with manipulation, but with kindness, patience, and unwavering character. And as for Lucy, the woman who tried to destroy her, she was nowhere to be found. After being exposed for her lies and deceit, Lucy had been cast out of the family, arrested for corporate sabotage, and left to face the consequences of her choices. In the end, the truth had surfaced, the lies had crumbled, and justice had found its way through. Later that night, as the couple shared their first dance beneath a sky full of stars, Ethan whispered, "Can you believe this is our life now?" Melissa leaned in, resting her head against his chest. "It's not a fairy tale," she said. "It's something better. It's real." The music swelled around them, the guests watching with warm smiles. But Melissa only saw Ethan. In that moment, she knew she wasn't the girl from the boutique anymore. She was a woman who had fought for her dignity, stood up against injustice, and proved that goodness, no matter how quiet, always finds its voice. And in a world full of people who try to take shortcuts, who choose cruelty over compassion, Melissa had shown that kindness is never weakness. It's power. It's resilience. It's what makes people unforgettable. So what's the lesson here? It's simple. Kindness always wins. It may not be the fastest route. It may not come with applause at first. But eventually, truth rises. And those who lead with love are rewarded in ways they never imagined. And those who build their lives on lies, greed, and manipulation, they will always fall. Maybe not immediately, but when they do, it's their own choices that bring them down. Melissa's story is a reminder that you don't need to be wealthy, loud, or powerful to matter. You just need to be true. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of integrity and love, then do us a favor, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that might change the way you see the world. Because here, we believe in stories that heal, that inspire, and that remind us. Good people still exist, and good hearts always find their way home.